This report grows out of a long time collaboration with the Commonwealth. Our first study that we did with them, with Andrew Charlton, was on the development round, what should be the agenda for the development round, and that led to a book called Fair Trade for All, the basic message of which was the development round didn't deserve that name. And we proposed what should have been on the agenda for the development round. The second report that we did was, now it's hard to believe, 7 years ago, was on aid for trade, where we laid out what ought to be the agenda for aid for trade. And this report is a follow-up on that, looking at where the aid for trade agenda is today and what can be done to make it more effective. In my remarks this afternoon, what I want to do is three things. First, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the origins, a particular perspective, and a way of seeing the aid for trade agenda. Secondly, I'm going to make some comments and assessment, a summary of not work that we've done ourselves, but an assessment of the work that we've seen, a number of studies that have done on aid for trade, and trying to put some perspective on those studies. And the third is what we think of as the real contribution of this. From our perspective, the development round agenda has largely failed, because obviously the development round hasn't been completed. Some people are still optimistic, and I hope you keep up that optimism. But the question is, given these, you might say, the failures so far and the dim prospects going forward, how to make trade more pro-development, and how to make the aid for trade agenda work better. So, within the beginning with the historical perspective on aid for trade, what I'm going to try to argue is that there were a convergence of two different strands of thought. Developments within trade and developments within the aid community that converge together that create aid for trade. And so I'm going to begin talking about the developments in trade first. And there were three developments within that I want to talk about. First, the aid for trade emerged partly because the global trading system was unfair and was recognized to be unfair increasingly by developing countries. The Uruguay round was unbalanced. The market access gains clearly favored the rich countries. Areas like services, intellectual property, advanced manufacturing, that's where the big advances were. And there was little progress made in areas of interest for poor countries, like agriculture. In case of textiles, they said, be patient, in 10 or 15 years, maybe we'll bring down the tariffs, and they eventually did, but the fact was those were postponed. Agriculture still has not been adequately addressed, and is a major barrier to the completion of the development round. The non-tariff barriers remain, a whole set of non-tariff barriers, product standards, phytosanitary conditions, and there were significant implementation costs that were disadvantageous to the developing countries. There was money promised to help with that implementation, but that money was never delivered. The loss of tariff revenues that came with the trade liberalization was never made up, and I'll comment on that a little bit later. A couple of numbers, statistics reflect the lack of balance. One of them is that a study estimated that after the implementation of Uruguay round commitments, the average OECD tariff on imports from developing countries was 4 times higher than on imports originating in the OECD. So they brought tariffs down, but mostly for developing for developed countries, very, very limited reductions for developing countries. Another example was import taxes collected by the U.S. from the imports originating from Bangladesh and Cambodia amounted to $1 billion US in 2008, which is more than the total amount collected on imports from the United Kingdom and France. So this just gives you a couple of pictures of how the tariff structure, the tariffs were really aimed discriminated against developing countries. The principle had been special and differential treatment for developing countries, but it became special and differential treatment against developing countries. It's not just a level, it was a structure. The structure included escalating tariffs that were designed to inhibit development. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Well, the bottom line of all of this is that some estimates suggest that the least developed countries, the ones that the Commonwealth has particularly been concerned with, were worse off by some $600 million as a result of the Uruguay round. So it wasn't as if, there was a lot of talk about how the world benefited, and the world may have benefited, but the developing countries did not. Well, it was partly in response to those failures that we got the development round. You all remember the attempt to have another round in Seattle that led to the hope of President Clinton that would be that there would be a round of talks called the Clinton round. And all we remember now are the Seattle riots. And the reason for this was many reasons, but one of them was that developing countries didn't want to be brought into another round that would turn out to be again more unfair. So finally, in the aftermath of the 9/11, the world came together for a minute. And it was at that moment of solidarity that the development round was born. At Doha, the agreement was, yes, we understand that the previous round had been unbalanced, we're going to correct that, and we're going to correct it so much that we're going to call this the development round. Well, the reality was that the advanced countries have not delivered on that development promise. They in effect reneged on those promises. There was, for instance, little commitment to significantly reduce agricultural subsidies and give developing countries greater special and differential treatment. Almost prototypical of that is what happened in the case of cotton subsidies, where Brazil repeatedly brought the U.S. to the WTO, and U.S. cotton subsidies were repeatedly found WTO illegal. They would rule them illegal, the U.S. would try to change the law, making it consistent with the letter of the law, but not in the spirit. And the WTO said, well, you didn't even get the letter of the law right, and they would rule against it. And then they would try again, and they tried again. And finally, the U.S. gave up and bribed Brazil and said, we'll give you money to just stop bothering us. But the point is that that may have made Brazil happy, but it left the cotton subsidies in place, hurting millions of poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, with the subsidies going to 25,000 very rich American cotton farmers. So that was sort of prototypical, it became emblematic of the reneging on the promise of Doha. In fact, as time went on, the rich countries put a range of proposals on the table called the Singapore Issues that would have reduced the policy space of developing countries. Well, not surprisingly, very shortly after the launch of the round in Cancun in 2003, the developing countries walked out of the Doha round. And the round has never really recovered. The third major force leading to disillusionment with trade and development was a rethinking, you might call an academic rethinking, a re-examination of our understanding of the relationships between trade and development. It became increasingly clear that the rhetoric that trade led to development was wrong. That had been a political agenda. A lot of people believed it. It was part of the Washington consensus that trade liberalization would lead to enhanced growth. But it turned out, as people looked at the data more carefully, they looked at the theory more carefully, it was not true. There were many pieces of evidence that brought about this change in perspective. At the very least, as people looked at it, it became clear that the effects were ambiguous and were contingent, dependent on certain things, and I'll come back to that in a second. One example is the Everything But Arms initiative of Europe, which was a really very important initiative that eliminated all the formally all the tariffs to the least developed countries, and you would have thought that was going to make a real big difference. This is real trade liberalization, and wasn't even reciprocal, did not have the effects that people had anticipated. It showed that tariffs were not really the binding constraints on trade. It was the supply side constraints, of a whole variety of supply side constraints, that were really the binding constraint on the part of the developing countries. For the developed countries, this was not a problem. It was for the developing countries. And there was a fundamental asymmetry that emphasizes symmetric actions can have asymmetric effects. Lowering tariffs was very important to developed countries, but not so important to developing countries. Well, there began then a research agenda looking, did trade liberalization increase growth? And a number of studies that have been done over the last decade have shown very varied results. That it was certainly not inevitable, didn't happen always. And there were actually a number of explanations I'll come to in a second. And then the final issue was whether trade liberalization reduced poverty, or whether did it in fact increase inequality. Inequality is becoming a major issue. Reference was made to the post-MDG agenda, the post-2015. One of the things that is likely to be on the post-2015 agenda is going to be some focus on inequality. But there is increasing concern that trade liberalization has been associated with an increase in inequality and not a reduction in poverty. Some of the reasons for these changes, one is that trade liberalization has been shown to increase risk. A paper that I did, a theoretical paper I did a number of years ago, showed that in worlds where there are imperfect risk markets, which is always, that trade liberalization could be Pareto inferior, that everybody could be worse off. So just the opposite of the mantra, which was that trade liberalization was supposed to make everybody better off. There are a lot of assumptions that go into that kind of a statement. We changed just one assumption, the assumption that there were perfect risk markets. And we showed that changing that one assumption led to the result that everybody in both countries could be worse off. Well, that's one example. And another one is when there are imperfect capital markets, again, characteristic of all countries. What happens is that jobs get destroyed faster than new jobs get created. So the idea was that trade liberalization would move people from inefficient protected sectors into more efficient unprotected sectors. But what happened in countries after country is they went from inefficient protected sectors into zero productivity unemployment. And the result of that was there was not economic growth. There was an increase in poverty, increase in inequality. And these patterns have been observed over and over again. A third example I alluded to a little bit earlier is that when you reduce tariffs in the United States and other countries in earlier stages of development, the easiest source of revenue is tariffs. Income taxes are very difficult to implement. So when you took away tariffs, you reduced revenues. Now the hope was that something would fill in the place. The IMF talked about VATs and other people talking income taxes. Didn't happen. So on average, when the tariff revenues went down, the other sources of revenues went up only a little bit, and the net fiscal space got contracted. And that, of course, meant there was less money for education, for health, for development. So again, there were anti-development effects. So the point was that trade liberalization, without other things, without the finance to create new jobs, without the infrastructure that would allow countries to export, without doing something with supply constraints, trade liberalization often did not lead to more economic growth, often led to more poverty, often led to more inequality. And then compounding these analytic studies, theoretical and empirical studies, were a number of historical studies. People started looking back at what happened in the history of Europe, the United States, in their development stage. And there was a very influential book by Ha-Joon Chang called Kicking Away the Ladder, who pointed out that the United States and many European countries, in the early stages of their development, did all the things that we were telling the developing countries not to do. And they were, in fact, essential in their development strategy. And more recently, many of the Asian countries, the East Asian, China, have all engaged in similar, we're all slow to liberalize their trade. Well, these factors produced a crisis in trade negotiations. Many of the developing countries were unwilling to participate in another round. They were afraid of repeating the imbalances of the Uruguay round, of having their arm twisted. They lost faith in the unfilled promises of the Doha Round, and they came to recognize that free trade by itself may not lead to development and actually may impede development. So this led to a crisis in the global trade community. The Doha Round stalled and it's remained stalled, and the developing countries became less willing to engage in trade liberalization. So aid for trade emerged as a convenient instrument to pacify developing countries, to hope, in some sense, bribe them to back to the bargaining table. Well, at the same time, the aid and the aid community, the aid and development community, were facing parallel challenges. So this is what I've just described as what was going on in the trade community. Now I want to talk a little bit about the aid community. They too were facing a crisis of confidence. One was that after the UN Millennium Summit in 2000, the donors faced the pressure to increase aid disbursements. I don't know if you remember the commitment. It seems so long ago. They, at Glen Eagles, they made a commitment to have aid of 0.7% of GDP. The developed countries did. I'll come back to it a little bit later to describe how well they've done in fulfilling that commitment. Well, the idea, though, was if you're going to ramp up aid, you wanted to do it well. Where was the money going to go? And one idea was aid for trade. So, like in the trade agenda, there was some intellectual forces that were undermining the old form of aid. there were a number of studies that questioned the effectiveness of aid. People like Bill Easterly. Now, I happen to think they were wrong. Actually, I think they were very wrong. And this is not occasion to try to explain where they went wrong. But the issue here isn't whether they were right or wrong. Too many people took them seriously. And so, because they took them seriously, there was a real challenge facing the aid community to figure out, do something different to persuade the donors that they could use the money well. And aid for trade was a new path of way of spending money that might not have the problems of the past. So in our interpretation, aid for trade was the product of a marriage of convenience between the trade and aid communities. It was a convenient response to the simultaneous challenges. For the trade community, it was a means to deliver a development dividend to entice poor countries back to the negotiating table. For the aid community, it was a channel to absorb growing aid flows while also potentially showing greater development impacts. So that brings me now to the second part of my talk, and that is a brief assessment of aid for trade. And obviously in a few minutes I can't really do an adequate job of assessment, but there are two questions that I really want to focus on. One was, aid for trade was supposed to be additional. Remember I said it was supposed to be responding to the need to increase the aid to bring it up to the 0.7% commitment that had been made in Glen Eagles and by the developing countries. So the question is it additional? If it's not additional, then you have to ask, is it more effective or less effective than other kinds of aid? And then the other one is, question was, aid for trade was not supposed to be a substitute for trade liberalization from the developed countries. It was supposed to be a complement. It wasn't supposed to be a bribe to say, like the bribe that was given to Brazil, don't bother us. Don't ask for reduction in agricultural subsidies. It was supposed to be a way of saying, okay, now that the developed countries are taking away their trade barriers, how do we take advantage? How can developing countries take advantage? So it's supposed to be a complement, not a substitute. So those are the two questions I want to focus on. And unfortunately, the answers are not very positive, at least as we see it. The aid for trade has not really been truly additional, at least not anywhere near the extent that was hoped. If it's supposed to be compensation for unfairness in the global trading system, aid for trade should be incremental to other development aid. The extent of incrementality is hard to measure, and there's often little distinction between traditional development projects and aid for trade. But what is very, very clear is the overall aid targets have not been met. So it's really hard to establish that there's really been the kind of additionality that had been hoped. So, for instance, the overseas development assistance from the members of the OECD group was just short of $80 billion in 2004, right before Glen Eagles. It rose substantially to $133 billion in 2012, but, this is a big but, that's less than half of what they committed. If the developed countries had lived up to their commitment, ODA, instead of being $133 billion, would have been $430 billion. Well, what's very clear is there is an enormous shortfall. So then the next question is, what about the effectiveness of aid for trade? If aid for trade is not additional, then it comes with an opportunity cost. And here, the big issue is, it's a kind of conditionality. It says, rather than aid going to the most effective, we're going to tie the hands and say it's devoted to trade. The question is that the most best way of spending the money. It's an additional restraint on aid. Well, our assessment was that overall, despite some very successful projects, it's been a disappointment. It's, as I say, not only has it not been truly additional, it continues to be dispersed through bilateral channels according to the priorities of donors and not the recipients. And most importantly, it was supposed to be a complement, not a substitute for pro-development trade liberalization in the Doha Round, but the promised pro-development Doha Round liberalization never occurred, such as in agriculture. So the best that can be said of it is that aid for trade is coming to be seen as a pecuniary payoff for undelivered promises in the Doha Round. There are some important aspects that have already been referred to of why aid for trade can be very important. The supply side constraints, infrastructure. These are some of the objectives of aid for trade, and I don't want to underestimate the importance of aid for trade in the potential of aid for trade in reducing those supply constraints. Well, I now want to come to the third, and you might say the more novel part of my talk, and that is how to make trade more pro-developmental, particularly in the context of the failures, as I say, of the development round, and awareness that trade is not automatically pro-development, and that aid for trade has been of only limited success. And there are two basic ideas. One is introduce a new, what I might call, right, and it's the right to trade that's based on a principle of right to development that was very strongly articulated by Ambassador Ismail, and as I mentioned, this earlier version of this report was given in London, and his comments at that occasion really helped shape our thinking. So let me just talk a little bit what the right to development means. The right to development would limit the applicability of WTO obligations when the enforcement of such obligations would have a significant adverse effect on development. In that sense, the right to development is a right not to be harmed by the imposition of trade rules. What I said is that trade not only doesn't always lead to development, in some cases it leads to de-development. It leads to harming developing countries. And so the right to development says that in one way or another, trade policy should not harm, should do no harm. It recognizes that in the formulation of the trade rules, the voices and concerns of the least developed countries were not given sufficient weight. The provisions and special and differential treatment were not adequately hardwired into the international trading system. The development itself is a complex matter, and that trade ministers, as good as they may be, have neither necessarily the competence nor interest to design a global trading system that promotes development. Rather than specifying a long list of ways in which developing countries might be adversely affected, and how developed countries might offset these adverse effects, for instance through aid for trade, it enunciates a broad, enforceable principle, the details of which would have to be fleshed out in the WTO dispute resolution process. We argue further that if advocates, as advocates of trade liberalization claim, trade is good for growth and development, with the strongest advocates claiming that it's necessary and almost sufficient, then actions taken by developed countries to impede trade are, in themselves, a violation of the right to development. A corollary, then, of the right to development within the international trade regime is the right to trade. So I want to talk just a little bit about this right to trade. It too, like the right to development, would be enshrined within the WTO dispute settlement system. Developing countries would be able to bring an action against any advanced country where three conditions were satisfied. A specific group of poor people within a developing country can be identified as being significantly and directly affected by specific trade or trade-related policy in an adverse way. The effect of the policy acts to materially impede the economic development of these poor people or the country or group of countries as a whole. And the impediment operates by restricting the ability of the people or the country or a group of countries as a whole to trade or gain the benefits of trade. So in a way, the WTO itself is a legal framework that attempts to enshrine certain rights. And what we're trying to do is to say there is a right to development and a right to trade that ought to be part of the legal framework of the WTO. Now, there are two implementation issues I want to discuss very briefly. And obviously, this is a broad topic that lawyers will enjoy talking about for a very long time. But the two I want to talk about are, first, remedies, and secondly, who has the right to bring actions. These are both important. The remedies are in some ways very similar to the kinds of remedies that are available within the WTO already. Elimination or changes to the offending policy, bilateral sanctions, compensation, in one way or another, including from a fund I'm going to describe in a few minutes. But it's important to realize that the right to sanction needs to be tradable. This was the idea that sanctions ought to be tradable. Was something that we introduced and argued for in our earlier book, Fair Trade for All. The WTO and most advocates of free trade believe in markets. And if you believe in markets, why not have a market for sanctions? Make the sanctions tradable. We have tradable emission rights, tradable, why not have tradable sanctions? Now, why is it important to have sanctions be tradable? Well, the best example that illustrates this is Antigua, which won a very big case against the United States. But if Antigua imposes a trade sanction against the United States, it hurts the country Antigua. They'd have to pay a higher price for their imports. Their citizens would suffer. But if Antigua could sell their right to impose sanctions to some other country like Brazil or some other country, then something might happen. So the point is that making trade sanctions tradable would change, would really level the enforcement playing field in a very important way. So I want to really highlight the importance of this idea. And anybody who believes in markets and anybody who believes in the WTO has to believe in markets, has to believe tradable sanctions is a good idea. Unless you don't believe in fair trade. So the second question is, who has the right to bring action? Like the first one, just writing down a right doesn't mean a lot. It has to be an enforceable right. And the problem is, bringing actions is not necessarily easy. It can be costly, and the people bringing the action can be intimidated. And we should recognize that. It's an unlevel playing field. And if a small country brings an action, there are all kinds of threats, like a loss of aid. There are lots of things that are in the toolkit of the big countries when they're dealing with the small countries. So what I want to talk about is, how do you address that imbalance, the fear of bringing action? So what we've come up with is three alternative mechanisms. One is that any group of poor individuals harmed by a trade policy of another country should have the right to bring a case against the WTO, a case before the WTO. In other words, it's not just countries that should have the right. Countries can be intimidated, but poor people who already have nothing to lose won't be so easily intimidated. Now, you might say, well, isn't it strange allowing private parties to bring an action? But we already have that in many of our trade agreements. In NAFTA, and there is the right to bring corporations. Corporations have the right to sue a government, but we don't allow ordinary individuals to sue. What I want to do, we're advocating, let's redress that imbalance. If corporations can have a right to action under a trade agreement, why can't ordinary individuals get together, poor individuals get together, and have the right to bring an action? So what we're arguing is that these individuals ought to have the right. But there should also exist an office, what we call the Defender of the Rights of Trade, probably located with an UNCTAD, that would have the right to bring suit against any country seen as violating the rights of trade as defined above. So just like you have somebody, when somebody violates the law, you don't have to sue. There's a legal framework. Somebody's violated the law. There's a public good in enforcing the rule of law. We all recognize that it's a public good to enforce the rule of law. That's why we have public enforcement of laws. But we don't do it in trade policy. But in my view, the right to development, the right to trade is so important that we ought to create a public enforcement mechanism that would bring a defender of the right to trade and the right to development. So the second idea I want to talk about is a global trade facility. So in addition to the right to trade, the right to development, we propose the creation of a global trade facility. It would be a dedicated fund established at the global level to which all donors would contribute resources that would be allocated to developing countries based on their needs for aid for trade. It would be, in other words, a commitment that they would have to make as part of, just like trade opening is an obligation, this would be part of the commitments, as part of the trade commitments that people, and enforceable commitments. There are a number of different institutional ways that this can be organized, different ways of, you might call, bases on which you would levy the revenues. We give a particular suggestion based on GDP, exports, the magnitude of agricultural subsidies and arms sales, arguing that agricultural subsidies and arms sales have adverse effects on developing countries, and those should be targeted specifically. It's like a tax on bad things. You should tax pollution because it harms. You should tax agricultural subsidies and tax arms sales because they harm the developing countries. So but there are other ways. This is obviously subject to a political debate about what is the best way of raising the revenues, but they would be obligations, not voluntary, and part of the enforceable within the WTO mechanism. And the second one is the administration, the governance. And we suggest it be done by UNCTAD, but the important thing is that there be a framework in which a special facility administered. That doesn't mean that each project would be administered. There would be competition among various projects for aid for trade. We envisage there would be many people actually engaged in the implementation, but you need to have a coordinator to run the whole global aid for trade, the global trade facility. So the final idea is that resources will be allocated based on proposals from a wide range of development organizations based on need and impact, and the development organizations will compete to offer the most efficient aid for trade programs and projects. And that kind of competition, we think, would facilitate making aid for trade more effective than it's been in the past. So let me conclude. The value of aid for trade has been based on a recognition that trade liberalization by itself is not a sufficient condition for an increase in trade or economic development. But aid for trade, I don't think, has delivered on its promise. It's not proved to be additional, predictable, and as effective as it could be. And without additionality, aid for trade is just another form of conditionality. Aid for trade has become, to too large extent, a substitute for meaningful reform of the global trading regime. I believe that there is a real scope for an effective aid for trade agenda that would loosen supply side constraints, help offset some of the decreases in revenues that are associated with reduction in tariffs, offset some of the increases in inequality and poverty that often result from trade globalization. And finally, recognition of the right to development, the right to trade in a global trade facility as enforceable obligations within the WTO framework would help ensure that international trade works for poor countries and for most people within those poor countries. Thank you.